Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 705 for June 10th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
There's always been a level of, put your nose to the ground, work really hard, make good products, and people will notice. And we still have that philosophy, but it can be a little frustrating when there's a lull or there's a pause or someone has heard about a brand new 2-year-old whiskey and they haven't heard about this fantastic single malt that has been distilled in Oregon since 1993.
It's hard to say who made the first American single malt whiskey, especially since the straight malt whiskey category has been around since the end of Prohibition. But straight malts only have to have 51% malted barley. And when it comes to Scotch-style single malts made with 100% malted barley, if Oregon's Clear Creek Distillery is not the first, it's certainly one of the first. We'll talk with Clear Creek's Jeanine Racht on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up later, along with your voice, the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. All on this edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. While whiskey tariffs were not specifically on the agenda at the G7 summit in Quebec, the trade war between the U.S. and its key allies certainly was. Of course, the tariffs imposed on U.S.-made whiskeys and other products by Canada, the European Union, and Mexico are in retaliation for new U.S. tariffs on imported steel and aluminum that were imposed at the start of this month. Before he left the summit in Quebec for Singapore and his meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, U.S. President Donald Trump vowed to retaliate against what he calls unfair trade practices and went so far as to threaten to end all trade with Europe and Canada. We're watching to see whether any retaliation by the U.S. includes tariffs on whiskeys from Europe and Canada, and we'll keep you posted. Meanwhile, the U.S. whiskey industry's largest trade group weighed in on the tariff issue Thursday. In a letter to Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, the Distilled Spirits Council expressed its concerns about the new tariffs on whiskey exports. The council estimates around $759 million worth of whiskey exports each year will be subject to the retaliatory tariffs. That includes 46% of global U.S. spirits exports. And looking just at whiskeys, that percentage rises to 65% of all U.S. whiskey exports. The council argues that those tariffs will also hurt U.S. farmers, as well as other sectors with links to the whiskey industry, including glass makers and shipping companies. In addition, a number of distillers have also argued that the U.S. tariffs will also make distillery expansion projects much more expensive by raising the cost of stainless steel used in tanks, fermenters, and other equipment. We'll have more on that story next time around. A quick update now on the Pappygate sentencing last week and the likely fate of the barrels and bottles of whiskey that were stolen from Buffalo Trace and Wild Turkey distilleries. We've now heard from Wild Turkey, where company spokesman Dave Carricker told us in an email that the stolen barrels of Wild Turkey will be destroyed because the whiskey was out of their possession at some point. Buffalo Trace has also indicated that its stolen whiskeys, including the Pappy Van Winkle whiskeys, would also be destroyed. The final decision is up to Franklin County Judge Thomas Wingate, who will issue his ruling once the final Pappygate case has been resolved. Let's talk about new whiskeys now. And we'll start by updating our recent story on the Macallan's new 72-year-old single malt that is the oldest Macallan ever bottled and the second oldest single malt ever. At the time, we reported that the list price would be around $60,000 a bottle, but Edrington provided details this week on the U.S. release. Approximately 156 of the 600 decanters that were made will be available in the U.S. market, and the price will be higher, $65,000 each. Of course, the U.S. decanters will have 750 milliliters of whiskey inside, instead of the 700 milliliters in those destined for the rest of the world. And that means each of those extra 50 milliliters is worth about $100 each. The latest single cask nation release made its debut Thursday night at the Whiskey Jubilee in New York City, and at $500 a bottle, it's the most expensive one yet. It's also the first blended malt the Jewish Whiskey Company has released, and there's a good story behind it, as Jason Johnstone Yellen explained.
Last year we sponsored what we thought was 2 swimmers and turned into 3 swimmers. Justin Fernal, Chad Anderson, and then Johnny Mundell joined them of Beam Suntory. Great guys. And so as they were going around Islay, they swam the full way around Islay. It was a remarkable achievement, and we collected whiskey from each distillery on the island. We collected it in a Kilchoman quarter cask, and we've now had it barrel marrying for 1 year. We launched it today at the masterclass that we had here before the Whiskey Jubilee, and it went over fantastically well. Natural cask strength, 57.4% alcohol. It's a tasty little treat.
And this is your highest priced whiskey yet, right?
It is. So we've always taken our pricing very seriously. Given that we sponsored an expedition, we had some different costs incurred here. But the other thing for us is we're not making profit from the Great Islay Swim Bottle. Instead, we're going to make a donation to the Royal Lifeboat Institute. It's the RNLI, and I've forgotten the N. It's probably Royal National, the way we do things in the UK. And so the donation will go to support the lifeboats who are rescuing people off the UK coast all the time. So we're very honoured to be engaged with that.
So it's $500 a bottle. How many bottles do you have left?
Well, to begin with, we were only selling fewer than 100. Because we're in a quarter cask, we've got limited availability there. And so yes, fewer than 100. I think we're about 30 or 40 into it.
There's a link for more details in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. And while we're talking about Islay, Beam Suntory's Simon Brooking is back from the island, where he's now doing double duty, representing both Laphroaig and Bowmore. How was the Fèis this year?
I got a tan, can't you tell? The weather was spectacular. The crowds were incredibly appreciative. I mean, all the distilleries just put their best out, and all the whiskies were very much appreciated. And the weather cooperated. It was a great day for us at Laphroaig as well as Bowmore. We couldn't have asked for better weather. The midgies came back on the Thursday, but by that time folks had had enough whiskey. And we released some really interesting bottlings this year. Along with our 10-year cask strength batch number 10 at Laphroaig, we also released our Carchus 2018, which a Fino, back to those kind of colourful, fruity, sherry experiments that John Campbell's been playing around with. 6 years bourbon, 2 years Fino. It's bright, fresh, almond, dry, a really splendid Carchus that was received very, very well.
When do we get that in the U.S.?
We should expect to see it hitting the shores around August. And then at Bowmore there was a couple of bottle your owns, 28 year, of which there were extremely small number of bottles available that people camped out starting at about 7 o'clock the night before and then we also had 3,000 bottles, 5 sherry casks, 15-year-old Bowmore. Delicious.
Nice stuff.
Yep. It was a really good year. Exciting to see just all the things that are happening on the island now. You know, with Ardnahoe almost online, and by this time next year, there'll be others in process. The island is buzzing right now, and there's some challenges as well. I mean, I'm sure you've been reading some of the press from on the local level as well as on the international level. The island is growing. Can we support that? And that's an important question that we need to make sure that the locals are taken care of, as well as the distilleries that are on the island. But there's a lot of faith, a lot of support from the islanders. We just need to do it carefully and make sure that it's done respectfully as well.
What's Beam Suntory doing, since you have 2 of the 8 current distilleries?
Well, our plans for expansion are moving forward. There is no groundbreaking. They're still finalizing location and design, but we are very hopeful for some really exciting news to be able to release when it's time to let the world know that Laphroaig will continue to thrive.
And Bowmore is landlocked. You really can't do much there, can you?
It's tough on that property when, being it's like Oban, Oban's built into the side of the hill. Bowmore is right there on the water in the middle of the town. It's very difficult for them to increase production, but I know that they have increased production just on a weekly basis because the demand for Bowmore continues to grow.
I'll have my tasting notes for the Laphroaig Cairdeas Fé Gilles edition later on. 5 years ago, Compass Box released a limited edition whiskey celebrating the 20th anniversary of Delilah's, the legendary punk rock and whiskey bar in Chicago. Delilah's is marking its 25th anniversary later this summer, and there's a new 25th anniversary bottling from Compass Box to go along with it. In fact, there is a link between the 2 editions. John Glazer and his team held back some of that 2013 release and put it back into casks to rest for a while. That whiskey made up the base of this year's release, along with whiskey matured in American oak ex-sherry casks. It's available now in Europe and will be available in the U.S. starting this month for around $100 a bottle. A sample is on the way. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. If you've ever been to Dublin, you've probably been to the Temple Bar at least once. It's one of the most popular places for tourists to visit in Dublin, even though its history goes back to well before Dublin became a hotspot for travelers. The Temple Bar's own brand of whiskey is now available in the U.S. and other export markets. But, as Larry Nieringer of Market Street Spirits explains, it's not just a bottler licensing the Temple Bar's name and slapping it on any old whiskey.
Tom Clancy, 4th generation owner of the Temple Bar, decided to return to the Irish tradition of whiskey bonding for individual pubs. It's a long-lost art in Ireland, and bottled these liquids, old Cooley distillery liquids, that he bought in bulk, in barrel, aged himself, blended himself, and bottles himself under the pub name The Temple Bar. Looking to get into the U.S. market, Irish whiskey in the U.S. has been on fire for over a decade, maybe 15 years. Too hard to resist. So he appointed us as the importer for these brands, and we're really proud to have them.
They've only been here since October. How are you doing so far?
So far, so good. It's slow because these are super premium priced entries, and it's still a mass market for Irish whiskey. We're seeing some growth at the high end of the market, which is very encouraging, but it's going nice and slow. I don't want to push it. I don't want it to be a fad. I want it to take its time and grow organically.
There are 3 versions available in the U.S., a 5-year-old blend that sells for around $45 a bottle, a 10-year-old single malt that sells for $65, and a 12-year-old single malt with a recommended retail price of $105 a bottle. Later on Behind the Label, we'll take a look at warnings about a potential shortage of older Irish whiskies in the short-term future. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. Want to crank up the flavor? Try Highland Park's full volume single malt. It turns the flavor all the way up to 11, then rips off the knob. Find out more at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Harlem Whiskey Renaissance is this coming Friday night, June 15th in New York City. The Edinburgh Whiskey Festival is on Saturday in Scotland, along with Westport Whiskey and Wine's 10th anniversary Bourbon Barrel Bash in Louisville, Kentucky. Briar Common Brewery and Eatery in Denver, Colorado is teaming up with Distillery 291 for a whiskey and beer pairing dinner June 19th. Whiskey Live Brisbane is June 22nd and 23rd, along with Whiskey Freedom 2018 on the 23rd in Perth, Australia. Blake's of the Hollow in Enniskillen, Ireland has a Redbreast and Powers tasting with Joe McGowan on June 29th. And Sweden's Box Distillery will officially become known as High Coast Distillery at its annual Whiskey Festival, June 30th and 31st in Adalen, Sweden. Right now we have 236 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a tasting, festival, or other whiskey event you'd like to let people know about, just use the contact form on our website and let us know about it.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. Aging in oak for 12 long years. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes. Bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up. Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whisky, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
I rarely do commentaries on WhiskyCast, but this time around will be an exception. I hope you'll listen all the way to the end of this episode. Right now, WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. It's been 25 years since Steve McCarthy started making single malt Scotch-style whiskey at his Clear Creek Distillery in Oregon. And it was many, many, many years later before the idea of American single malts became popular among craft distillers and whiskey drinkers. Clear Creek has been plugging along since 1993, making as much of McCarthy's single malt as they can. Steve McCarthy sold the distillery to Hood River Distillers back in 2014, and while he's stepped back from the day-to-day operations, he's still very much a part of Clear Creek and McCarthy's. I sat down with Clear Creek's Jeanine Racht the other night on a New York City park bench to talk about the whiskey that helped start the growth of American single malts, but perhaps got a bit lost in the shuffle.
I think that's a good way to put it. We've never been one to toot our own horns. There's always been a level of, put your nose to the ground, work really hard, make good products, and people will notice. And we still have that philosophy, but it, can be a little frustrating when there's a lull or there's a pause or someone has heard about a brand new 2-year-old whiskey and they haven't heard about this fantastic single malt that has been distilled in Oregon since 1993. But our philosophy is things come full circle. We have been around since 1985. We're not going anywhere. We will continue to make great products, and I think integrity and patience and loyalty are very important to the Clear Creek philosophy. And so it's kind of exciting that people are either meeting McCarthy single malt for the first time, trying it for the first time, or hearing about it for the first time, or they forgot about it and they're coming back to us. So for me, being at Clear Creek for 12 years, it's also come a little bit full circle, because I feel like there was a point where it was heavily allocated. We had hundreds of people lying outside of the distillery tasting room when we released it. We would sell it within hours. We would, allow everyone to have one bottle maybe to purchase. But it's a fun roller coaster. It's a very interesting industry. It's a changing industry, but I think it's also not to invent the wheel. We're not reinventing history. We're following where our beer predecessors came before, where our wine predecessors came before in the U.S. and then even beyond. You look at European cycles, and this isn't anything new. It's the way that our agriculture and our industry is shifting and moving, and people are not only caring about the food that they're putting into their mouth, farm to mouth, farm to table, they're now finally starting to care a little bit more about the liquids. And I think whiskey is a very special, separate section of the spirits industry, because I think that there's an education and a passion that has been inherent there, where it hasn't been in, let's say, the vodka industry. This is not a disrespect to people that make it or write about it, but I feel like more people write and care and follow whiskey, at least in the U.S. and abroad, than almost any other spirit. It is very much tied to people's passions, to culture, and once again, not that other spirits aren't, but there seems to be this education level. It's different. When I talk to people about whiskey, I have a lot more people asking about what's the mash bill? What are you aging it in? How long? Is it chill filtered? When I talk about brandy or grappa, people's eyes glaze over. Ask if it's that blackberry brandy that their grandma, served. So that was probably the longest answer that you could possibly get from one question, but...
Oh, no, we've had longer. But you talked about being on allocation. The supplies have never been that large for McCarthy's, have they?
They never have been. Steve started out with his first barrel and then, started making a little bit more. But the Oregon oak that we age McCarthy is in, the Quercus Garryana, it's air dried for 3 years. We're talking long periods of time in terms of making it. It's not kiln dried. There are a lot of beautiful American oak casks made in the U.S. and the process is a lot shorter. So there's a lot more in terms of abundance outside of fires that happen, which are horrible, that shorten some of the pipeline. We don't have the ability to make giant amounts. We're trying to make more. We try and listen to demand. It's a changing market, so we end up with less allocations and more for our distributor partners when they order. But I think it'll be interesting. I think that whiskey it's just at the precipice. It's going to get bigger. We've already seen it in Japan. We're seeing it in China. We're seeing it abroad, and I think demand is just going to get bigger and bigger. We'll be at the point where everyone's pappies.
When did you guys start using Garryana oak? Because we've seen other distillers that have made a big deal about this in the last couple of years, especially folks in Oregon. Eastside and Portland has been making a very large claim to being a pioneer in Garryana oak, and the guys at Westland and Seattle have done it for a couple of years, but they've acknowledged they weren't the first. How long has Clear Creek been putting whiskey into Garryana?
Since 1993, from the very first distillation of McCarthy's, and one of the reasons why it's such a weird, special product for us at Clear Creek. Most of our spirits, we source the fruit from within, a 90-minute drive of the distillery. Back when Steve was starting to research single malt, he fell in love with Lagavulin 16-year. He wanted to emulate it. And we grow barley and we grow peat moss in the Pacific Northwest, but he couldn't find anyone willing to work with him on a very small level. A reminder, once again, it was the microbrewing boom. People were making a lot of money selling barley to brewers. And so Steve wanted to make this small amount of whiskey. He was already growing pears in the bottle, and people thought he was crazy. So he started sourcing from Port Ellen, the barley. And the moment that he started making the single malt, he just thought, well, I have brandy stills, so I'm going to distill it once. That's what I do, not the traditional twice distillation that occurs in Scotland a lot. And he met Rick DeFerrari from Oregon Barrel Works in Eugene, who was already making these brilliant barrels for the wine community. Steve was very much tied to the wine community. We still are as distillers, because what we make is seasonal. We make grappa, and wine is inherently tied to the earth. Not that beer isn't, but grain isn't seasonal in the same way that fruit is. And wine, you don't walk into a winery and really have to explain to a customer when you run out of your Pinot Noir that you can't whip up a batch. That isn't inherent in other spirits. It's inherent in wine. And Steve really wanted to make his spirits thought about in the same way that wine was thought about. And if he made a single malt, he wanted to tie it to the earth as well. I think some fancy people call it terroir. I usually just laugh after I use that word. It's a great word, but it sounds kind of snotty. So he thought Oregon oak, this guy is making this great company out of Oregon oak, Quercus garryana, which was poo-pooed by the wine industry. It's a little oily, a little funky, has really nice tight grain. When you air dry it for 3 years, you end up with something not similar to Limousin oak, which is what we age all of our brandies in, but you end up with a really beautiful counterpart. And he started playing around with that in McCarthy's, and it was meant to be. Over the years, although it's always been aged in Oregon oak, Steve played around with a sherry finish. So for quite a few years, he would finish the last couple months in a big sherry butt, basically. Played around with finishing it in a little Limousin. We've done, a special release in Oregon. It's a cognac finish for Multnomah Whiskey Library, but it has always been aged in Oregon oak, either 100% or at least 90%. Once again, we don't toot our own horn. Steve thought it wasn't really needed. It was an underused oak, and we tell our story, and we tell people we use Oregon oak. But I think it's been fascinating to find some of these distilleries when you find, I think, what do we call it in the industry? A soundbite in media? Their soundbite has definitely been tying on their product to Oregon oak. And, everyone gets to choose their own soundbite, and we're just going to continue to make good products.
Are you surprised by the way the American single malt movement has taken off, having done it for 25 years?
I don't think there are any surprises in the industry at this point. Can I be surprised? Absolutely. But I think I always try and take it with a grain of salt and either have a historical perspective or try and research where did this happen before? How can we learn from this? How can we adapt? And what I've noticed and what I know from Clear Creek is we have been around because we didn't force anything. Steve never looked at the market and thought, what does it need? It was almost the opposite for a few products. What's weird, expensive, and won't sell. But I think when you have a real story that isn't a marketing, branding story, and you have people that care about it, that go and talk to people, and you make a good product, it's great. What's next in the industry? I think, to be honest, something that Steve fought for and something that this might be more of a hope than something that I foresee in the future, but I will say it regardless because I hope those two things are the same. Truth in nomenclature. I think that we need better labeling laws. I think it's ridiculous that there's not a requirement for ingredients. And I'm not talking like a trademarking or an IP issue. I'm talking we need to know what's being added to our spirits. We now know what's added to our food and the sprays and the tinctures. There are some horrendous things and some great things. And I think that it will be really important moving forward for people to know, where things are grown, where are they made. Because we have, and I know that you've seen them, and of course I won't say any names, but I'm out in the market and you have a 2-year-old distillery with a 6-year-old whiskey. And, the consumers, there's this almost trusting nature, which, of course they should believe what's put out there, what's put on the label. But I think one thing that we've always worked towards and something we've always wanted is you should know what you're getting into when you have that bottle. You should have a customer be able to, if you're in a busy liquor store and someone isn't able to help you right away, you should be able to grab that bottle, read it, and know what's going on.
Where does Clear Creek go from here? What's in store for the next 25 years? I know Steve has stepped back to a certain extent from the business. What happens now?
One of my favorite things about Steve, outside of his very stubborn and loyal nature, is he built a crew around him that he was able to pass along his knowledge. We would have people apply all the time that, we've distilled here and we've done this. There's not a single person that I can think of at Clear Creek that's ever been hired that had distilling experience. He wanted to teach them based on, maybe they're an art major, an anthropology major. It's very much an art equally as it is a science. The science is the part that won't kill you, and the art's what makes it smell and taste good, and the integrity. So I think for us moving forward, Steve has bequeathed this gift of a company that shouldn't exist. Hood River Distillers bought us in 2014, and we've got some great equipment. And when you really think about it, this is a weird company that is pretty special. We should not exist along with the no-named giant companies that exist in this world. Everyone has a place. There's a place for big guys, little guys, small guys, and gals. But I'm just happy to be along for the ride. It's been a great place to work, and I feel like I work a little bit more in the real world now. We might have been in our own little bubble, but I think that we will, we will continue to push the boundaries of what is local, how can we make it better. When you're purchased by a big company, you find out who your friends are. I could have shown you my phone that day. There were phone calls, there were texts, and fortunately not a lot of negative ones. I was shocked by the negative ones. But the people that I'm pretty much still friends with now are the ones that reached out and they said, congratulations, good job, what's next? And I think that is a great way to look at the industry and how, I would like to look at life in general is what's next, what's the big exciting thing. So, working under the Hood River umbrella, but still, keeping our identity and making these great spirits out of beautiful local fruit in Oregon and Washington, and not compromising.
When do we see another whiskey, though?
Can I tell you offline? We're working on a few items we're very excited about, but I think we'll see some new McCarthy's Expressions before anything else. We have a beautiful 3-year-old whiskey, but I think one of our desires is to play around with things with a little more age on them, which takes some time in the barrel room. We have a lot of creative folks that work for us, and also on the Hood River side, so we're doing some playing around with things. That was a really good way of not answering it, right?
Yeah, but I've had worse ways of not answering that question. When might we see something? A couple years down the road, theoretically?
I think we're going to be looking at something in about 1.5 years or 2 years. No guarantees, but we have to make sure it tastes good. That's the number one thing. We're not going to throw it in a bottle and put it out on the market if we wouldn't drink it ourselves.
Now, was McCarthy's actually the first American single malt? It's not quite clear, though Jeanine Racht and the Clear Creek folks are firm on that point. Keep in mind that there is technically no official definition for single malt whiskeys in the U.S. federal regulations for whiskey, so it's not as simple as checking the records. Technically, single malts fall into the category of malt whiskeys, which only have to contain at least 51% malted barley, and those have been around for a long time. But we are talking in this case about Scotch-style single malts with 100% malted barley. Here's what we do know. Steve McCarthy started making his single malt in 1993. Your group and Lance Winters at California's St. George's Spirits didn't lay down their first cask of single malt whiskey until 1997. And the Karakasevich family at Charbet in California didn't make their first whiskey until 1999. So, at least in the modern era of distilling, Clear Creek appears to be the oldest so far. But if there's one out there that's older, I'm sure we'll hear about it after this story. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old, the Distillers edition, and the throwback 8-year-old at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with the McCarthy's Oregon Single Malt. As we heard, it's matured for 3 years in Oregon Garyana oak and bottled at 42.5% ABV. The nose is malty, with a touch of lemon peel, along with straw, honey, and vanilla. The taste is lemony and tart, with notes of clove, dark honey, straw, and barley sugar, while the finish is long and tart with a hint of spice. It's a simple, clean, and enjoyable single malt. I'm scoring McCarthy's Oregon Single Malt an 89. Jeanine Racht also gave me a sample of the single-barrel cognac-finished McCarthy's that is exclusive to the Multnomah Whiskey Library in Portland. Once again, it's bottled at 42.5% ABV, but the extra couple of months in an ex-cognac cask really does make a difference. The nose is still malty, but now has a hint of nuttiness, along with touches of citrus and tree fruits, straw, and muted spices. The taste is fruity, with red grapes and apples, just a touch of clove, honey, straw, and a good maltiness. The finish, it's long and fruity with subtle spices. And I'd love to see more McCarthy's like this one. I'm scoring the McCarthy's Multnomah Whiskey Library Single Barrel a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, where they're making room in the trophy case after the recent San Francisco World Spirits Competition. Best Bourbon, Henry McKenna's Single Barrel. Best Small Batch Bourbon, Elijah Craig Small Batch. They're just more proof of Heaven Hill's pedigree for making whiskeys with award-winning flavor. Meet the family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Earlier, we heard from Simon Brooking about the Laphroaig and Bowmore Faygiel bottlings, and Simon brought back some of the 2018 Laphroaig Cairdeas Fino cask. It started out in first fill ex-bourbon barrels before being re-racked into the Fino sherry casks. It's bottled at 51.8% ABV. The nose has a soft peatiness. It's nice and fruity with notes of fresh peaches, red apples, honey, and brown sugar, and has a nice balance and complexity. The taste is thick and chewy, starting off with dried fruits, while the peatiness takes a few seconds to develop. There are also notes of sea salt, creosote, honey, and a touch of almond oil. The finish has a lingering smokiness, along with touches of sea salt and dried fruits. I'm scoring the 2018 Laphroaig Cairdeas Fino Cask Edition a 92. I was also able to get my hands on a sample of the Faygiel release of Ardbeg's Grooves Single Malt. Like the committee edition released earlier this year, it's finished in charred red wine casks that opened up grooves in the barrel for the whiskey to soak into just a little bit more. The one difference from the committee edition is that it's bottled at 46% ABV, while the committee edition was bottled at 51.6%. In this case, though, the difference in bottling strength actually adds to the balance and complexity. The nose has subtle touches of peat and heather, along with black tea, lemon, and honey notes, just like the committee edition. The taste is thick with a delayed peatiness, honey, brown sugar, and good spices. And, to my taste, is just a touch more well-rounded than the higher-strength committee version. The finish is long and peaty with gentle touches of heather and honey. If you missed out on the committee edition, this one will not disappoint you. I scored the Ardbeg Grooves Committee Edition a 93, and that's the same score I'm giving the mainstream release, also a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of 2,200 different whiskeys at WhiskyCast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. A couple of weeks ago, we talked with Brook Laddie CEO Douglas Taylor about the relaunch of the Port Charlotte range of heavily peated Islay single malts. Ira Seligman at LWars85 on Twitter had a question after that interview. Hey, WhiskyCast and Brookladdy, is there a difference between the vatings for the new Port Charlotte 10 and the second edition that was launched a couple of years ago? Well, I try to let the distillers answer those types of questions, and within 24 hours, the Brookladdy social media team came back with this response. Different cask types, different bottling. Same malt profile, same distillation, same peating level, 40 ppm, same age. Second edition was bourbon, sherry, Tempranillo, and other French wine casks. This is 65% first fill bourbon, 10% second fill bourbon, 25% second fill French wine casks. And by the way, the gang at Brookladdy sent me a sample of that new Port Charlotte 10-year-old. It arrived on Friday, too late to taste for this episode. I'll have my tasting notes for it on an upcoming episode. Speaking of shipping, I had a little fun with UPS and the Teamsters Union this week after a news story broke on the Teamsters approving a strike against UPS if they can't get a new contract. You see, I make references to the Whiskey Ferry a lot, and there are actually several whiskey ferries. Needless to say, if there's a strike at UPS, those whiskey ferries will be out on the picket lines instead of delivering whiskies. We just can't have that. So, I tweeted out a call for both sides to work out their differences for the good of all of us. UPS responded with this note, "Hi, Mark. The voting results were expected, as this is common in negotiations. The current contract remains in force, so it's business as usual while negotiations continue. The contract does not expire until the end of July, and, by the way, the Teamsters never did respond." If you have a comment, a question, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. It's time for Behind the Label now, our inside look at some of the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. You may have seen news stories or comments on social media in the last few days about a coming shortage of Irish whiskies. And those comments led to this tweet the other night from @StoneKettle on Twitter. "Sweet Wookie Jesus, what fresh hell is this?" Okay, let's take a deep breath now. This has nothing to do with the trade war and tariffs. As we've mentioned many times over the years on WhiskyCast, up until just a few years ago, there were only 3 distilleries making whiskey in Ireland: Middleton, Bushmills, and Cooley. While it was always possible to buy bulk whiskey from Middleton and Bushmills, John Teeling founded Cooley back in 1989 with the specific goal of producing bulk Irish whiskey for sale to independent bottlers, retailers, and other customers, though Cooley did have some of its own brands as well. In a lot of ways, Cooley was the Irish equivalent of MGP at the time. When Beam Suntory bought Cooley at the end of 2011, it started using more of the production for the distillery's own brands like Kilbeggan and Tyrconnell, and gradually cut back on the amount of bulk whiskey it was selling to customers. In a few cases, it actually ended bulk whiskey sales that weren't being backed up by a long-term contract. Since then, a lot of smaller distilleries have opened up, while William Grant & Sons built the much larger Tullamore Dew Distillery in Tullamore to secure its own supply chain. That brand has historically sourced almost all of its whiskey from Middleton, but Grant's knew that it could not grow the brand based only on that supply and will still depend on Middleton stock while its own whiskey matures. John Teeling has noted in recent interviews that what we're really looking at is a shortage of aged Irish whiskey. He opened Great Northern Distillery back in 2015 based on the Cooley model and has been laying down as much grain, pot still, and single malt spirit as the facility can produce. But that spirit is only now approaching the legal minimum of 3 years old. Of course, that's the same situation a lot of Ireland's smaller distillers are facing as well. With the global boom in Irish whiskey demand, the supply of aged whiskey, that 8 to 12-year-old stuff, is going to get tighter and tighter over the next few years. The good news, though, it will get better, probably around 10 years or so from now. If you have something you'd like us to dig into for Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Finally, a few thoughts on the death of Anthony Bourdain, the chef, author, and storyteller. Anthony Bourdain took his own life Friday in a French hotel room at the age of 61. In March of 2015, he joined us for episode 525 of WhiskyCast as part of his work with the Balvenie on its Rare Craft series.
I drink whiskey at certain times in my life when I'm sort of sentimental, reflective. Honestly, sitting in a pub in Glasgow at a nice old pub at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a really nice Scotch whiskey. I like it with one rock. I know this is heretical. But in the late afternoon with the dust motes floating in the air as the sun streaks through a dirty window pane and maybe some music on the jukebox, that's just a fine time to be drinking good whiskey.
Food and drink don't just nurture the body, but also the soul. Perhaps one of the most important aspects about Anthony Bourdain was his ability to bridge divides and be open to any culture. The simplicity of a shared meal was his own personal form of diplomacy. His life gave witness to connections, and that's a lesson we can all grow from. We've included a link to a list of resources in our show notes at whiskycast.com, and our thoughts are with Anthony Bourdain's family, friends, and colleagues. Our cask strength conversation continues all week long online. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Tumblr at WhiskyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.